Everyone. I'll be speaking today about, I think, a very fascinating area of research, hypermentalizing and attachment stress in borderline personality disorder, and especially how it all relates to the theoretical framework of the mentalization model. So, quick overview. First, I'll introduce BPD, its core symptoms, outcomes, and some important theoretical background. I'll argue the mentalization model offers a very promising framework for better understanding BPD, but it also has a notable gap. I'll argue why we should address that gap, and I'll talk about how we could approach it. I'll offer a research question, an aim, and a hypothesis. So BPD, it's a mental health condition. Diagnosis is a little bit different in the DSM and the ICD, but the symptoms are the same. Difficulties regulating emotions, impulsive behavior, disassociation, feelings of emptiness, intense fears of abandonment, and patterns of distressing, unstable relationships. About 2% around the world have the DSM diagnosis, and it carries an elevated risk of self-harm and suicide, actually on par with schizophrenia and bipolar in many studies. So, a very serious condition. How well do we understand it? Well, there's basically two models. The biosocial model on the left is more widely known and longer standing, but it is somewhat limited theoretically these days. It emphasizes genetics, but since 93, there hasn't been a whole lot of good evidence for genes being a major aspect of BPD. So that leaves the environment. But this model itself doesn't really offer much detail in that way. There's a lot written about how its definition of the invalidating environment is a bit vague and hard to operationalize. So I think that's why there's been room for the mentalization model to rise to prominence, because it offers a lot more about social and environmental factors. It also offers very specific mechanisms for how all core symptoms work, whereas the biosocial model really only actually talks about emotion regulation. So a lot to work with. What is this model exactly? Well, first, you might be wondering about this word mentalizing. So to mentalize is just to interpret thoughts and feelings, both of ourselves and others. So if I walk into an exam feeling butterflies or restlessness, I might mentalize myself as being anxious about the exam. If I see a friend walk out of the exam looking upset, I might mentalize them as thinking they did badly. So what does this model actually say about BPD? Well, it all starts in infancy. And it predicts that those with BPD have poor relationships with attachment figures, so parents, guardians. This doesn't necessarily mean trauma or violence or abuse per se, but it does mean one or both of these. Maybe an infant doesn't have their emotions mirrored or reflected or validated ultimately. We know that having emotions reflected helps infants understand them. And without this, emotions remain confusing and self-understanding doesn't develop comprehensively. Caregivers might also be outright rejecting or indifferent. And if this is their first, most significant experience of another person, the infant doesn't learn to see others as comforting, just as inevitably hurtful. And understandably, this is distressing, both for the infant in the moment, but the association lasts into adolescence and adulthood too. Attachment means pain. So anything attachment salient, meaning any context where there's a chance of connection or safety with another person, like with a partner or a friend, anything like rejection or a breakup or indifference, especially, even any reminder, like any fleeting thought even about these themes of attachment will activate fight or flight because of these bad experiences. And intense emotional activation like this overwhelms the brain's capacities to mentalize, which I think makes sense. If you're deep in fight or flight, it's obviously very hard to consider ourselves or others completely rationally. But as a thinking species, we try, right, to make sense of ourselves and others. But with the hardware of rational mentalizing offline, the model says that attempts to do so are heavily impaired. So that basically means either hypomentalizing or hypermentalizing, according to this model. Hypomentalizing is basically a lack of mentalizing, but it's taken to kind of a surreal extreme. Like, who am I? What am I? Do I even exist? It's more tied to mentalizing the self. Hypermentalizing, though, is about others, and it involves interpretations of others that are very confidently believed, but stretch reality. Like, that person didn't say hi, and I know it's because they have a personal vendetta against me. And you can imagine how that might affect relationships or emotion regulation, maybe even inspire impulsive action. So as you might be picking up, this is the last bit of this model, that these problematic kinds of mentalizing directly cause BPD symptoms. So this whole model is very detailed. How does it hold up? Are there any gaps? It holds up quite well in a lot of ways. So there is a direct link in longitudinal studies between emotional neglect in childhood and BPD diagnosis later on, actually over and above physical and sexual abuse. So it's not direct evidence of poor initial attachment relationships per se. Those are very hard to measure, but it does kind of circle that territory. It's also extremely well replicated in BPD research that people with BPD have avoidant or insecure attachment styles, which, again, not direct evidence of those poor initial attachment relationships, but is certainly kind of carving out territory within that area. People with BPD also seem to be more physiologically reactive to reminders of attachment themes. And stress, but interestingly, especially stress about attachment themes, is associated with less activity in the brain regions associated with rational, balanced mentalizing. But this last bit of the model is where I think we have some work to do, because these operationalizations I talked about earlier, hyper and hypermentalizing, both have interesting limitations. Of the two, though, I think work on hypermentalizing offers us the most currently. For one thing, hypermentalizing as a construct is better validated. It's more observable and behavior-based, which really helps. But most importantly, hypermentalizing is intuitively linked to these core symptoms of dysfunctional relationships and emotion regulation, which are seen as kind of core gateway symptoms. They influence other symptoms, and many believe kind of tie the symptom set together. These seem to be central in recovery. Better relationships and emotion regulation seem to drive improvement of other symptoms. So what are we working with hypermentalizing literature? Well, it does correlate with BPD. That's found in meta-analysis. But there is a problem here because hypermentalizing is actually associated with a lot of other conditions too. And the correlation is actually very similar, about 0.24, 0.25, with conditions that are seemingly quite different from BPD, like autism, ADHD, eating disorders, even somatoform disorders have a very similar correlation. So that's a problem because the mentalization model is a model of BPD. But if BPD is a unique condition, maybe we're missing a piece of the puzzle here, right? But is this a problem with the model or is it a gap in the literature? Because if you remember, the model does not just predict hypermentalizing. It predicts hypermentalizing under attachment stress. So stress that is about attachment themes, thinking about a breakup, rejection, invalidating behavior from a partner, it's contextual. But interestingly, none of the literature actually examines hypermentalizing under attachment stress. Maybe participants in these studies are under attachment stress, maybe other kinds of stress, maybe no stress. The effect of attachment stress on hypermentalizing has not actually been isolated. So why does that matter? Well, it would help answer a fundamental question. Is hypermentalizing in BPD state-based, contextual, or is it more trait-like, happening across contexts? The model itself is actually a bit unclear about this. If you remember, it does actually imply a level of trait hypermentalizing. It is to an extent baked in from infancy. Rejection or indifference from initial caregivers becomes a template for how infants and then children, adolescents, and adults come to interpret everyone, not just those initial caregivers. That is part of the model. But the model is also very clear that attachment stress makes hypermentalizing elevated or more extreme. So in BPD, does it become more extreme under attachment stress? And if so, how much? More data on this, I think, would help us better understand exactly how core BPD symptoms manifest. The contexts are important. It would also help conceptualization of BPD more broadly, because with data about the impact of attachment stress on hyperventilizing BPD, we could do the same with other conditions and make more granular comparisons than we can now. Maybe trait hyperventilizing is transdiagnostic, which is what seems to be the case at the moment. But maybe elevated hyperventilizing under attachment stress is indeed what makes BPD unique or part of it. Or maybe other conditions show elevated hyperventilizing under attachment stress too, in which case the diagnostic categories might not be so clear, but still we'd have a better base of understanding for the contexts in which symptoms work, both in BPD and potentially in other conditions as well. This also has major clinical implications. Therapies like mentalization-based therapy, MBT, target hyperventilizing, among other things. But we need to know how hyperventilizing manifests. If it is global or non-contextual, maybe MBT should focus treatment or target hyperventilizing across contexts. But if it is tied to attachment stress, maybe treatment should work on it within contexts where there's attachment stress. So what would research on this look like exactly? Well, the basic question is, do individuals with BPD demonstrate elevated hyperventilizing under attachment stress? The aim would be to investigate whether individuals with BPD do demonstrate elevated hyperventilizing under attachment stress as compared to general stress or no stress conditions. And I would hypothesize that individuals with BPD will show higher hyperventilizing scores when under attachment stress as compared to general stress or no stress conditions. And this hypothesis is based on the prediction of the model, but also prior literature about an association between BPD and extra reactivity to attachment salient stress, and also evidence that attachment salient stress does impair rational balanced mentalizing over and above general stress. So to wrap it all up quickly, BPD is a serious condition and urgently needs more work, especially on what exactly makes it a unique experience. And I think a major issue there is whether hyperventilizing is state or trait-based. And that would help clear up this fundamental aspect of a very prominent model. This will be important theoretically in that way, but it also has direct clinical implications. Thank you.